to do this work from every hand. Our cry comes ringing through the land. Jesus calls for reapers, time is yet to be. What wilt thou, O Master, here am I send me? Here am I send me, am I send me. Here am I send me, am I send me. Here am I send me, am I send me. Ready at thy bidding, Lord, send me. There's a plaintive cry of mourning souls distressed, and the sigh of hearts who seek but find no rest. These shall have love and conscience will free. Ready at thy bidding, here am I send me. Here am I send me, am I send me. Here am I send me, am I send me. Here am I send me, am I send me. Ready at thy bidding, Lord, send me. There were souls that lingered on the brink of woe. Lord, I must not hand on there to let them go. Let me go and tell them, brother, turn and flee. Master, I'm forsaken, here am I send me. Here am I send me, am I send me. Here am I send me, am I send me. Here am I send me, am I send me. Ready at thy bidding, Lord, send me.
Acts 25, verse 1. Now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea, and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So, said he, let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him. After he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, "Neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense." But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, "Do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me?" But Paul said, "I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer, and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar." Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, "To Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go." Now when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man left prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face, and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal, and ordered the man to be brought. When the accuser stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, "I would like to hear the man myself." "Tomorrow," said he, "you will hear him." So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. Then at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, "King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish people petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had done nothing deserving death. And as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. But I have nothing definite to write to my lord about him. Therefore, I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him." Paul was on a mission. The mission was so important to him that he was willing to suffer all kinds of trials and mistreatments for the mission. This is why Paul was imprisoned right now. Paul was proclaiming Jesus in Jerusalem, which enraged the Jews who then wanted to kill him. The Apostle Paul is in the middle of dealing with people who seem not to be interested in hearing the truth which he is proclaiming. And you'll notice as we open Acts chapter 25 that we read about Festus, a Roman governor over Judea. Remember in chapter 24, Paul stood trial before Antonius Felix. But rather than making a decision, he left Paul in prison for how long? 2 years. 2 years. We are told at the beginning of Acts chapter 25 that Felix is replaced by Porcius Festus because he mismanaged a violent outbreak between Jews and Greeks in Caesarea. So Festus is going to deal with the situation with Paul and the Jews immediately. The chief priests and the leaders of the Jews presented their case against Paul to Festus now and asked a favor to send Paul to Jerusalem. Now we know why they want Paul in Jerusalem. They have a conspiracy in place to kill Paul. But Festus wants to have a trial and listen to what Paul has to say. So the Jewish leaders did the same thing they did when Felix was governor. They presented a number of charges against Paul that are false. Verse 7. Paul argues the same defense that he had before. He has not committed any crime against the laws of the Jews, against the temple, or against Caesar. Paul should be released because the charges cannot be substantiated against him. But notice verse 9. Festus wants to do the Jews a favor. So Festus indicates he wants to send Paul back to Jerusalem for trial. Paul knows that he cannot do that. Paul barely got out of Jerusalem the first time with his life when his nephew told him that there was a conspiracy in place to have him killed. So Paul cannot go back to Jerusalem. Paul answers in verse 10 that he is where he belongs. The problem needs to be sorted out by a Roman court. He has not done anything wrong against the Jews, and Festus knows this. If I have done wrong, then charge me with the wrong and execute the punishment. But if there is nothing to their charges, then you cannot hand me over to them. Therefore, verse 11, Paul appeals to Caesar. It is clear that Paul does not think that Festus is going to rule for him, but is going to send him back to Jerusalem because he wants to do the Jews a favor as the newly placed governor over the region. But I want you to see how the truth was ignored here. The Jewish leaders don't care what the truth was concerning Paul. They're making all kinds of false charges, just like they did against Jesus 30 years earlier. Festus, he doesn't care about the truth either. Paul says that Festus knows that he has not done any wrong, but the truth does not seem to matter. No one will seek the truth. No one will act on the truth. The truth is ignored. Well, Festus finds out that Agrippa has come to Caesarea. Now, King Agrippa ruled over Galilee at that time and seems to have come to congratulate and pay his respects to Festus. Agrippa's father, if you remember, is the one who had the apostle James killed and the apostle Peter arrested and was eaten by worms after failing to give glory to God. His grandfather was Herod the Great, who murdered children in Bethlehem in an attempt to kill Jesus. Agrippa has a better understanding of the Jews and the Jewish law. Now, the rest of chapter 25 is Festus seeking Agrippa's counsel as to what to do with Paul. Festus's problem is that he is going to send Paul to Rome to stand trial before Caesar, but he does not know what to say about him. He does not have any charges to which Paul is going to go to Rome for. Agrippa says that he would like to hear from Paul himself. This sets up for another big show. In verse 23, we see Agrippa and Bernice entering the hall with great pomp and circumstance. All the Roman commanders and prominent men of the city are there. This has gotten too big, and nothing can be done quietly here. This is not going to be a quiet discussion. Festus has Paul brought in and then make a big pronouncement about having Paul stand before Agrippa to understand the charges against Paul, which are to be continued in chapter 26. But before we finish, I want to talk about some takeaways we can learn here from chapter 26. First of all, God's providence is always at work. Even though Paul is caught in a political and legal storm, God is guiding the events to fulfill his purpose. Jesus had already told Paul that he would testify in Rome, Acts 23 verse 11. And now that promise is unfolding, even though corrupt officials and false accusations are coming, it seems like, from everywhere. The point is, God can use even unjust systems, reluctant rulers, and delayed processes to bring about his will in our lives. Secondly, Paul's courage and integrity shine through. Despite being unjustly imprisoned and facing powerful political figures, Paul remains composed, but yet bold. He doesn't compromise his faith or back down from his mission. He doesn't plead no contest or doesn't plead guilty for a lesser sentence. He stands for the truth. Folks, we have to stand firm in truth and conscience, even when the odds seem stacked against us. Courage and integrity are extremely powerful witnesses. Thirdly, Festus, notice, prioritized politics over justice. Festus knew Paul was innocent, but he still entertained the Jews' request and tried to send Paul to Jerusalem as a favor. His concern was political favor, not moral clarity. The lesson here is to understand that compromising truth for political or personal gain leads to injustice. Christians must be people who care more about what's right than what's convenient. Can I say that again? Christians must be people who care more about what's right than what's convenient. And then fourthly, Paul's appeal to Caesar was both legal and strategic. Paul knew the religious leaders in Jerusalem wanted to kill him, so he exercised his right as a Roman citizen to appeal to Caesar. This ensured his protection and fulfilled his calling to testify in Rome. What's the lesson for us? It's okay for Christians to use legal rights wisely. Paul's example shows that we can pursue justice while still trusting God. Fifthly, the gospel is not bound by prison or politics. Though Paul was on trial, the gospel is still advancing. Each courtroom appearance becomes a pulpit. Soon Festus and Agrippa will hear the message too. Never underestimate how God can use difficult circumstances to open new doors for his message to be heard. And finally, Paul's life was a living testimony. By this point, Paul's character, consistency, and devotion to Christ are known to everyone. Jews, Romans, soldiers, governors. His life speaks loudly before he even opens his mouth. Your example may prepare people's hearts long before your words ever reach them. Okay, next time, let's hear Paul's defense in Acts chapter 26. Thank you so much. Have a great and wonderful day.
For Christ and the church, let our voices ring, let us